Okay. Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies Podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is.
Molly Fee, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Interdisciplinary Social Sciences at the University of South Florida.
Fantastic to have you here. And you have great, great film noir lighting, if I may say so. Even though I'm seeing you in color, people won't be able to see this, but there's a sort of beige, whitey contour to the background in terms of wall, ceiling, door. And then these fantastic lights that are just shedding a little bit of glow in the background. And then, the Venetian blinds. So I'm just waiting. I don't know whether you're the private investigator, the femme fatale. I mean, what do you think you are in this story that I'm constructing?
I think in reality, someone who's working from home at the moment in my guest room.
Okay, you've just made it much more exciting than I could. I've got a query that I put to all my guests, which is to ask what's currently dynamizing, impeding, interesting, preoccupying you in that guest room?
Yeah, I think one thing that's been preoccupying me a lot over the last year is the state of refugee resettlement in the US. There's been such a drastic shift in how the government is approaching what has historically been a really important humanitarian program for refugees. And it's really taken sort of a 180 turn that has completely changed the purpose and approach of this program, with a lot of questions raised as to what the future may look like for refugees.
And that's your principal area of research. And I'd love to talk about the US situation in particular. But before we do that, could you talk more generally? And the reason I ask this is that it seems to me that the notion of the refugee, which really gets going after the war in the context of displaced persons, as they were then called in Europe, particularly Eastern and Central Europe, that then led to a commitment by sovereign states that then expanded to be something more in terms of basic human rights. But that expansion, and you'll correct my adumbration if it's wrong, but that expansion, as I've seen it, seems to be going in reverse now. It seems to be diminishing. And you're nodding at this point, which makes me feel good about my current adumbration, although not good about what it signifies. So, can you give us a bit of a history of what refugees are, what
Mhm.
their rights are, and what's happening generally? Because you can see in the European Union, in Australia, in Canada, similar revanchist right-wing rebellions against the idea of refugees to what we can see in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. I think right now we're at this unfortunate moment of a lot of retraction and withdrawing from these programs that have long shown international responsibility sharing, solidarity, and humanitarian commitment to refugees among a lot of governments in the global north. And, over time, over the last several decades, there's have been waves up and down of countries, resettlement countries, expanding their capacity to resettle refugees, contracting that capacity. But I think right now, unfortunately, we're at this very exaggerated moment of contraction, with countries really sort of rethinking the extent to which they have a commitment to bring refugees to their country. And so, sort of for the more general background to all of this, refugees are people who have fled their home country for various reasons related to persecution, whether that's religious, political, whether it's fleeing their country due to war, violence, many reasons that people would flee their home country by under duress. So these are not people who are moving out of choice with options at their disposal. It's people who really have sort of a life or death choice in front of them, and they have to make the decision to go despite their best intentions to want to stay. And so people who have already crossed an international border and gained refugee status, those are people who are considered internationally recognized as refugees. Um, Alternatively, in sort of the discourse, people also talk about asylum seekers, who are those who have crossed an international border, but who don't yet have that formal refugee status. So, my research has primarily looked at refugees, people who have already gained that international recognition and status from the UN Refugee Agency, from host governments, and really are sort of those who have have asked for that humanitarian protection and received it. And at the moment, there are millions of people who fall into that category, with many more who are asylum seekers, who are categorized as other things, yet who really, if you look at them, sort of fit under the umbrella of the refugee experience.
And a lot of this is movement from global south to global north. By no means all of it, but I'm guessing the majority. I'm thinking of Syrian refugees, in over 1 million, going to Germany a few years ago. But I'm also thinking of many more refugees crossing from Venezuela to Colombia in the last 10 years.
Well, interestingly, I think in the news and in sort of general political discourse, we're very aware of refugees and asylum seekers who are moving from the global south to the global north. Yet in reality, the global south hosts the majority of the world's refugees. Because if you think about it sort of in practical terms, if someone's fleeing their home country, chances are they're crossing an international border to a neighboring country. And most refugees end up stuck in those neighboring countries, either awaiting safe return to their home country, waiting for some sort of more permanent integration into the country of asylum that might be neighboring their country of origin, or waiting for resettlement to the global north. And so you have countries, so for example, with the Syrian war, you have Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, they have ended up hosting the majority of the Syrian refugees that fled. Yet in the news, we hear much more about those who were crossing into Europe, who were resettled to Canada, who came to the US. But it's sort of this disproportionate coverage of where refugees are going that I think can sometimes skew our perceptions of which countries are managing refugees and their displacement more than others, when really, in reality, it's the governments in the global south that are doing the lion's share of the work.
And I note that some countries, I'm thinking here of Britain and Australia, look to global south countries in Africa and the Pacific to take asylum seekers from anywhere in the world that want to go to those Anglophone countries. Quite incredible. Quite incredible. And in some cases, wanting to send people to very dangerous authoritarian states where their lives will be further undermined and put at risk. I mean, it seems as though there's an increasing selfishness in the global north about this, and the blindness to what you've just corrected me about, namely that the global south takes the vast majority of global south asylum seekers and refugees.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when you take a step back and look at this from a global perspective, it really reorients where these flows typically go and where people typically end up staying. And I think to me, one of the biggest concerns is that people flee their home country under duress. Oftentimes, it's a decision made within a moment's notice, or it might be something that is, tension pressures building for a few months, a few weeks with escalating war, and then people decide it has gotten too dangerous, we need to leave. And then they end up stuck. And they're really the what are typically called the three durable solutions for refugees, which are return to the home country if the situation has been resolved and it can be safe. Local integration in the country of asylum, so that first country that people cross into, that country takes it upon themselves to help those refugees integrate locally and meaningfully in the host community, or third country resettlement, which is what we hear about more with the US, Australia, Canada, where these governments that invite refugees to come continue their lives there. What we really find is that these three durable solutions, when put together, fail to actually provide a resolution to the majority of the world's refugees. And so this toolkit that the global humanitarian infrastructure has at its disposal isn't meeting the needs of displacement as it stands today. If we take resettlement, for example, less than 1% of the world's refugees will ever get resettled. And so you have all of this news coverage about those who do get resettled, yet it's really just sort of like a drop in the bucket of the needs of the global refugee population.
Since I started working in the global south full time, I don't have a lot of disposable income, but what I have in terms of charitable giving, which used to go when I lived in wealthy countries all over the place, now goes to United Nations High Commission on Refugees. Is that a good choice? What's your take on UNHCR?
Yeah, I think UNHCR, it faces the same challenges that a lot of big global bureaucracies face, and they have a really important mission, and they have a lot of people who work there that are very dedicated to this work and to this mission. Yet, when you have this sort of organizational behemoth, it's really hard when you have all these multiple layers of bureaucracy and approvals and influence from donor countries and all of these complicating factors that make the work that much harder to do. And I think UNHCR is an incredibly important organization when it comes to supporting refugees throughout the world. I think the people I've met who work at the UNHCR are incredibly dedicated and to the work that they're doing, and they're oftentimes doing the best they can within all of the constraints and parameters they're given within this big organization. I think I wouldn't want to see what the global humanitarian system would look like without UNHCR. I think they play a very important role, but I think there are also a lot of local organizations that are harder to find out about and harder to understand that are doing a lot of the work on the ground that is vital to the everyday lives of refugees. So I think UNHCR, when it comes to managing this very complicated international system, you sort of need an organization like that. But at the same time, there's a lot of smaller local grassroots groups that are doing a lot of work as well that I think often doesn't get the same recognition.
No, thanks for saying that. In terms of the United States and Western Europe, countries like France and Britain, these massive imperial powers, these immensely wealthy countries, what has triggered, do you think, this extraordinary revulsion at a popular level against refugees when these countries, A, have imperial responsibilities, but B, especially the United States, have long histories of immigration?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what we've seen a lot in a lot of countries over the last 5 to 10 years is this political weaponization of immigrants and refugees and asylum seekers is this easy category to use as a scapegoat for other ills that might be going on in society. And so, I think it was a very easy example is the rhetoric that was used around the Brexit vote. It really sort of pitted all of the challenges that people were facing. It used immigrants and refugees and asylum seekers as sort of the category that was responsible for everything that was going wrong. And so it has become this political tool that candidates and governments have been able to use to to blame problems on immigrants and refugees. And I think if you actually were to look at this situation, it couldn't be further from the truth. If you look at cases of communities, cities, countries that have opened their doors to immigrants and refugees and facilitated the process, it boosts the economy, it adds tax dollars, it can help revitalize communities where, say, school enrollment has dropped because families are leaving. It helps to fill vacant apartments and open local businesses and all of these things that we need sort of for thriving communities. And so I think it has become this tool that unfortunately there's been sort of this isomorphic effect where people have picked up that they can blame immigrants and refugees and that works politically. And so they've used that to serve their own gains as well.
And this has seen a successful transformation of policies, not only on the part of the right, but the social democratic left as well, as it tries to stop losing votes to this imagined wave of immense disaffection with the very idea of refugees. Um, Prof, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, I think that that's definitely true. And I think that there's temptation um, to see that it has worked for political gain and to do that as well. Yet I will also say that in my own work in communities throughout the US, it's really surprising to see in places you wouldn't suspect there'd be a lot of support for immigration and refugees, that actually at the local level, you find a lot of people who, regardless of their political affiliation, their religious beliefs, their own family histories, there is, I think, more support at the local level than we might realize. If you actually, talk to people in communities throughout the US or throughout the UK, France, other places, that when it's sort of used in the media as this big scary thing, people react. But if you actually talk to them and maybe it turns out their neighbor or the parents of their child's friend, or they know immigrants, they know refugees, and in a different context, they might have a very different way of talking about it and understanding it.
Could I ask you to elaborate a bit on that part of your research, going into different communities and talking to folks and what you found out? I mean, you've got a good US name, Molly, and you have a US accent. So that means some people might feel able to say negative things to you that they wouldn't say to somebody who didn't have a nice US first name and had an accent in inverted commas. So I'm guessing if you're getting a lot of, in a sense, positive feedback about refugees, then that's probably quite reliable as data.
Yeah, so I think you're certainly getting at. I'm an ethnographer, and I do field work in my research sites, and definitely my positionality as a U.S. born white woman shapes the types of responses that I get when I'm in the field. And so I've done research in three different US cities that have all served as resettlement destinations. Um, my most extensive research was a comparative study of refugee resettlement in San Diego, California, and Boise, Idaho. And I specifically chose these two cities to be a comparison of most different types of resettlement destinations in the US. So, about half of the resettlement destinations in the US are these cities that we typically think of as immigrant gateway cities. So, Chicago, Miami, Los Angeles, um, New York, Boston, all of these cities we think of as being immigrant hubs. In the US, they resettle refugees as well. But about half of the top 50 communities of resettlement in the US are actually places that would be considered more new immigrant destinations. So the types of communities we don't really think of as big receiving communities for the foreign born. So these are places like Fargo, North Dakota, Fort Wayne, Indiana, Boise, Idaho, Abilene, Texas, communities that have long been participating in resettlement successfully. And yet they don't really sort of register as places that are becoming these diverse communities of refugee reception. And so it was very interesting spending 6 months in Boise, Idaho. I worked as a casework assistant in a resettlement agency there, and I knew very little about Boise before I went. I had visited once for a weekend to set up the logistics for my research. And I was so impressed with what I saw over the course of my 6 months there. There's so much local community engagement. There's so much dedication and support for making Boise a welcoming place for refugees and really embracing this new identity that they have as this city that is slowly becoming more diverse. Boise, the population of Boise is over 80% non-Hispanic white. So it's a very racially homogenous city, and they don't really have a long history of ethnically and racially diverse immigration. Um, their immigration history is sort of linked to Basque migration. Um, and so this has brought sort of this new diversity to a community that really hasn't grappled with it previously. And there have been growing pains, but there's been a lot of local engagement and volunteerism and support. And you find it within religious communities that are really stepping up to support newcomers within the local government, within community and organizations. And so I think that you have situations like that replicated throughout the US in these places we don't really hear about, um, where they're doing the work of resettlement and doing it really well, despite what's often criticized as sort of a very bare bones government approach to refugee support when people arrive.
And it's tempting to look for a correlation between that and capital P politics. And it's fascinating that most of the places you've nominated as research sites are actually Republican dominated states where supposedly popular public opinion is against immigration in general, but certainly against refugees, and most of all, perhaps against those without papers. So is this something where if people are there legally, that's more acceptable to the communities than if they're there without papers?
Well, I think you raise an interesting point because what has often been used as the rhetoric around gaining support for refugee resettlement is that these people are have been forced to flee their home country. They've been waiting often for decades in refugee camps or urban areas in other countries in very difficult conditions. They've gone through a very extensive um, selection and vetting process, and then they are invited to continue their lives in the US or Canada or Australia or wherever. And so unfortunately, sometimes these factors that correspond with to refugee resettlement, it's been used to make them categorically more appealing than other migrants who might arrive through other means. And I think that it's important to recognize that just because someone may have arrived in a country such as the US through different means, whether that's arriving undocumented, arriving as an asylum seeker, arriving through what's considered humanitarian parole, just because they have these legal categories that are put onto them doesn't mean that they also aren't refugees as well. And so I think sometimes these different legal categories get used to weaponize certain groups over others. And historically, refugees who have been resettled have benefited from this because they're seen as the most vulnerable, they're seen as the most vetted, they're seen as those who are quote unquote more deserving of coming to this country than others, when really it's just a matter of geography and circumstance that shapes how someone might arrive across an international border.
In your participant observation, what are some of the things that surprised you that you didn't expect to encounter but did?
Yeah, I think one of the most surprising things in my field work in Boise, perhaps this is shaped by my own ignorance as someone who has often lived and moved to these places we think of as typically, big urban areas like Los Angeles, Washington, D.C. I grew up in Boston, sort of these more diverse places. I didn't really know what to expect in Boise. And frankly, I thought um, it would be a very hard place for a refugee to be resettled. Refugees who are being resettled in the US typically don't have any say over their destination. It's decided at the federal level. And through the national resettlement agencies where refugees will go. So they find out shortly before their departure for the US where it is they'll be living in the country. And so, for people who are assigned to Boise, Idaho, no one I met there had ever heard of Boise before. And so it was sort of this very nerve-wracking thing to be told you're going to a place and you have no idea what it's going to be like. And so I had certain preconceived notions about what it would be like for refugees once they were resettled in Boise. And frankly, what a lot of people told me was how fortunate they felt to have been resettled in Boise and how they felt like they were so lucky that that's where they were sent to, as opposed to being sent to a big urban area that we may think of as more appealing because it has more diversity, more, cultural organizations, more co-ethnic communities, places of worship, things like that. That really what people were looking for was a safe, secure place to raise their children in a community that they felt like they could get to know. And Boise offered that for a lot of people. They felt like they had the peace and quiet that they didn't have when they were refugees living in a country of asylum and particularly those living in a refugee camp. And so what was most important to them was that their children were going to school, their children were safe, they could pay their rent in a suitable apartment. And that they just sort of had this peace that they didn't have before. And in contrast to my research in San Diego, which, we think of as San Diego as one of the most appealing places to live in the US because of the climate, because of the proximity to the ocean, all of these things. Life was really, really hard for people who were resettled there. The rent was just too expensive. And everything just felt like families were barely making it month to month to make ends meet. And so everything was really spread out in San Diego. It was really hard to get from one place to another. Life just felt very overwhelming there. And so I think it sort of helped recalibrate my understanding of what it is that makes a good place for a refugee family to live. And oftentimes it may be these smaller cities um, that have lower costs of living, that have sort of these senses of community that really help refugees once they arrive.
I wanted to ask you about not only your scholarly publications, but also in quasi-popular periodicals. I'm thinking here of The Hill. You wrote a great piece last year called Halting Refugee Services Endangers New Americans. And I wonder if you could tell us, A, about that question of endangering Americans, but B, what it's like writing for these different outlets.
Yeah, so when President Trump took office for his second term, well, to rewind a bit, when President Trump took office for his first term, one of the things he quickly did was enact the travel bans that really halted the arrival of a lot of refugee groups to the US, those that were coming from Muslim majority countries. And in other ways, his administration really looked to piece by piece dismantle the infrastructure that supports refugee resettlement in the US. And so it really weakened the program across the country. Fast forward to his second term, there was a much more concerted effort to more drastically hinder the the organizational structure that makes resettlement function in the US. And so one thing that happened very shortly after he took office was he issued a stop work order where essentially the caseworkers in resettlement agencies throughout the country were no longer able to continue their work that's funded by the federal government to support refugees who have arrived. And so for refugees arriving in the US, there's a very standardized program that supports them through casework assistance and very minimal financial assistance during their first 90 days. And then there's some additional services that continue for about 4 to 6 months after that. And so essentially, what happened was this stop work order meant that those refugees who had already arrived in the country, but were within that initial first several months of their resettlement, all of a sudden, their caseworker could no longer support them in the capacity that they were supposed to. And so imagine a family that arrived in the US a week ago to Clarkston, Georgia, or Chicago, Illinois, or Seattle, Washington, or Boise, Idaho. They're new to the country. They don't know anyone in that community. They don't speak English. They have been told that certain things will be available to them, most notably a caseworker who really helps to manage sort of all of the initial assistance that a refugee family needs to get settled, help them find housing, help them connect them to all sorts of different organizations, help them get their social security card, all of these practical things that are necessary for life in this country. And within 6 or 7 days, all of a sudden, that person can no longer help them, and they don't know anyone else in the community. And so it really sort of pulled the rug out from under a lot of people who were owed this assistance and this support that even when it functions in the best way is very minimal and very rushed. But I can't even begin to imagine how stressful and chaotic it would have felt for that minimal assistance to disappear. And so it really sort of like stopped the gears of resettlement in this screeching way that only made it harder for families who had just arrived. And was really sort of an unprecedented move by the administration. And so there have been a few moments where certain things happen in the news, in global politics, that it feels like as an academic, where usually it takes a very long time between doing research and getting my research published, often in outlets that aren't read by the general public. There have been certain moments in time where it feels like the needs are too pressing, and it feels very important to me to write something that has a quicker turnaround and gets to a different type of audience. And so I've written a few op-eds over time, a couple of times for The Hill. And I think that it's one of those things that you spend a day or two writing as passionately as you can because it feels very important in the moment. And you just hope that there's an outlet that picks it up that is able to help you share your research for more practical purposes. And I think that always throughout my work, I've been motivated by the practical implications of the work that I'm doing. And so it's been a way for me to sort of make that connection and get my research out to a more general audience that hopefully can move the needle a bit.
Especially in something like The Hill, which has a readership in K Street and on the Hill itself, i.e. the capital. Prof, going back to the scholarly outlets, one of your striking academic pieces is challenging the social construction of the idea that once a refugee means always a refugee. Could you tell us about that construction?
Yeah, so this was something that came about in my year of research in San Diego and Boise. That I was curious about, but wasn't sort of the main focus of my research. Yet it turned out the findings were very interesting in the end. And so throughout this research, I interviewed 60 people who had been resettled to the US, 30 in San Diego, 30 in Boise. And at the end of each interview, I asked the person if they felt like the word refugee was something they still identified with. Now that they had been resettled, many of them, the people I spoke with, had been resettled for several years, 10 years, 15 years. And I was curious about whether they felt like the word refugee was something that was still a part of their identity or if it was something that, they long shed since coming to the US. And I would say that I found as many answers as there were people I spoke with. And ultimately, it's a very personal thing, whether someone still feels like they're a refugee or not, or how and why they identify with that label. But what was particularly interesting was for the people I spoke with in Boise, several people said that regardless of how they identified with the refugee label, because they were living in a city that is predominantly white, that doesn't have a strong history of ethnically and racially diverse immigration, and because more than 50% of the foreign-born population in Boise came through the resettlement program, there's this assumption in Boise that if you speak English with an audible accent, if you're not white, the assumption is that you came as a refugee and that you are a refugee. And so there's often this imposition of the refugee label that people had to navigate after they had arrived in Boise. And so I would hear it sometimes in public events where someone would say, my refugee colleague, my refugee neighbor, my refugee friend, as opposed to just calling this person my colleague, my neighbor, or my friend. It sort of became this constant prefix that for people who had come through the resettlement program, it was this inescapable label that they just had to live with in the community because they were always visibly identifiable as refugees. And so in San Diego, in a city that is on the US-Mexico border, that has a very diverse foreign-born population, people who came through the resettlement program, they weren't as conspicuous. And so it was really up to them whether they embraced or distanced themselves from this label that they had had to navigate in a prior stage of their life. Whereas in Boise, it became this imposed social category that people really couldn't escape as they went about their daily life in the community. And so for some people, they wanted to shed that past. They wanted to move on from having been a refugee. It was the most terrible thing that had happened to them in their lives, and they just wanted to move forward. And so to constantly be reminded of that, it was sort of a way that made people feel like I can never truly be of this new place that I'm working so hard to belong to because I will always be seen as a refugee. I'll never be seen as just a resident of Boise or someone who lives on this street and part of this neighborhood. I'll be the refugee that lives on this street. And so it became this othering that I think was not malicious in intent, but it had this effect that really reminded refugees that they may truly never belong in the community as full members.
Absolutely. Now, Prof, you co-authored a terrific entry in the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Sociology about these topics. And one of the arguments you guys make in that piece is that theoretical understandings of these matters are somewhat hampered or rendered secondary by the fact that the field is constructed around policy and program questions, that it's very policy oriented. I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on that for us.
Yeah, so I wrote that piece with a sociology graduate student, Durana Sadie at UCLA. And it's really an overview sort of about the scholarly approaches to refugees and asylum seekers from a sociological perspective. Though really, when you're looking at research on forced migration and refugees, it's very interdisciplinary. And so it's sort of impossible not to draw from other fields as well. And I think one of the things that we wanted to convey was that there is an important distinction between the legal categories that we see function in the world, and the actual sociological categories that refugees, asylum seekers, undocumented migrants, other categories of migrants actually experience. And so these legal categories put people into boxes and shape the rights and access that they have based on the legal status that they're given. And this can change in any moment. We're seeing this currently in the US with the rescinding of temporary protected status for certain groups. For example, Afghan refugees who had arrived in the US under humanitarian parole, their status is in jeopardy, and they may soon no longer be recognized as refugees deserving of support and assistance and long-term legal status. And so these political and legal categories can change at any given moment. Yet at the same time, you have these sociological categories that are more based on the person's experience and the conditions under which they migrated. And those don't always map on to each other neatly. And so what
Yes.
we wanted to convey was that
Lisa, please.
it's important to recognize also the sociological conditions that may be shared actually across many of these groups that in political and common discourse we label as different things.
Prof, you have a new book out, Believing in Light After Darkness. A wonderful title. Here in the Global South, we just don't get books in English by and large that are scholarly, especially. So, like perhaps many listeners, I haven't read it. Would you mind giving us the scoop? And this doesn't have to be the 25 words or fewer elevator pitch. This can be, and furthermore, in chapter 3, I maintain, or whatever it might be.
Sure. So my book came out in March, and it's based on the research that I conducted in San Diego and Boise. Um, and essentially, the overall argument is that typically we talk about refugee resettlement in the US as this program of integration and this humanitarian solution. And what I found over the course of a year as a casework assistant in a resettlement agency in San Diego and then in Boise was that if you're looking at the experience of refugees who are coming to the US, it's premature to call this very rushed, very minimal program of assistance a program of integration. And that this time that refugees are first arriving in a new country, in a new community, navigating all of the things that come with arriving in a new place, it's their experience is much more akin to another displacement than it is to a period of integration. And so throughout the book, I make the argument that resettlement is better understood as another displacement for refugees. And I think that even under the best of circumstances, resettlement will always be displacing for refugees. It completely upends someone's life. They have to figure out how to navigate and survive in a new country, a place that they likely never thought that they would be living, in a system that is very different from any other they've previously navigated. Um, and so even when there is ample support and perfect conditions, I think it will always be disorienting and displacing. But in particular, throughout the book, I show that there are certain characteristics of the way the US has historically resettled refugees that make the experience all the more displacing. And so, for example, the financial assistance that refugees receive is extremely minimal, and refugees are pushed into employment very quickly, which tracks them into low-wage manual labor jobs. And for a lot of people, this is an occupation for which is a poor match for their physical health. It's a lot of older refugees are being pushed into jobs in hotel housekeeping, factory work, meat processing, very physically demanding jobs that aren't a good match for these people who are arriving, that result in paychecks that are at or just above minimum wage, where they're barely making ends meet each month. And so there are certain features of the US resettlement program that exacerbate this displacement that's always going to be there. And so I think that my hope is that with this book, which is very ethnographic in nature and hopefully something that is readable and approachable to a general audience as well as to sociologists and policymakers, is that if we understand resettlement as this displacing experience, how can we rethink the types of services and supports that would actually benefit refugees when we're aware of how displacing and upending it is to their lives?
Sounds great. Sounds great. I think giving real experiential contour to these matters is tremendously important, because so often in the bourgeois media's coverage of such matters, these voices are silenced. You hear the loud, rowdy, angry white men screaming, and I'm talking about the ones who are in Congress or the White House, as well as those who are on the streets. And you hear slightly defensive liberals saying, oh, please, this is not really who we are. Whereas in fact, it absolutely is a lot of what we are. But rarely the voices of those who are the objects of these struggles. So, Prof, I have one more question for you. And once you've answered it, I'd like to give you the opportunity to add anything you wish. That could take the form of going over terrain we've already traversed, where you want to offer something else, or it might be entirely new material where we haven't touched on the relevant topic. Does that sound okay as a means of bringing things to a close? The Prof's been very, very tolerant of the fact that through most of our conversation, I've been having my breakfast, but it's truly over now, Prof. It's just the tea now that's left. So my last question, which is a bit of a tenure and promotion query, so sorry. What's next?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm now 1 year into my tenure track position at the University of South Florida, so it's something that I'm certainly thinking a lot about. I think that one thing that I'm very eager to look into moving forward, currently at the present moment, when we look at resettlement at a global level, as we discussed a bit earlier, the US isn't the only country that has reduced its pledges to resettle refugees. This is sort of a phenomenon that is spanning a lot of countries that previously have resettled refugees in large numbers. The most drastic example is the US, but this is happening elsewhere as well. And this has had real ramifications for the UNHCR and their capacity to do their work, and also their capacity to refer cases for resettlement. So a lot of the refugees who get resettled, the majority of refugees who get resettled, have first been vetted and interviewed by the UNHCR. And then if that case seems that it meets the criteria for particular countries' resettlement programs, those cases will then be referred on to those countries to decide if they want to resettle those refugees or not. Right now, the UNHCR is working with 30% of the global resettlement capacity that it did in 2024. So all of a sudden, they can only refer 1/3 of the cases that they previously were referring. And so, what I would love to inquire about further with these UNHCR field office staff is all of a sudden, if you have 1/3 of the capacity that you previously did, how do you choose which cases to pass on to these resettlement countries? Because if under the best of circumstances, less than 1% of refugees are getting resettled, already they're making decisions about the most vulnerable among the vulnerable. And how do you make those decisions now that you have so few spots available for resettlement? And so I think that part of the motivation for this is to understand how these field office staff make these very difficult decisions when they're presented with cases that really all merit resettlement. And so, what are the factors that weigh in whether they refer cases or not? And how is this reshaping which refugees are getting resettled? And what does it mean for the refugees who now are not getting resettled? And I think to perhaps move on to the final bit, I think the last thing that I would say is that one thing that has always been very important in my work, and I hope is reflected in my book, is that truly the experts on refugee resettlement and forced migration are the people who have gone through this process themselves. And so I learned so much from the people I spoke with who had been through the resettlement process, and including those who then worked in resettlement agencies and worked in the infrastructure that resettles refugees. And so I think that if we're looking to really understand what these processes and situations are like, we have to turn to the people who have actually been through it themselves. There's only so much that I can say as someone who has studied it, but there's really a power that comes from speaking with the people who have undergone these experiences as well. And I think we really need to look at them as the experts, and the ones who have the most clear perspective on what this is like.
Thank you so much, Prof. Fee. All the best with the new book. All the best with tenure. I have a tip on how to get it, by the way,
I'd love to hear it.
and it's a fail-safe. So for months, ¿qué tal? In the period running up to when I was seeking tenure, I was teaching at NYU. I just couldn't do it. I couldn't create the digital archive required. I couldn't construct the arguments. It was just awful. And the folder in which I was seeking unsuccessfully to do this, Ola, was called Tenure, all in capital letters. And then through some trick of the fingers, I accidentally retitled it Manure. And from that moment, everything, so to speak, flowed really well. So if you run into any difficulties, just rename everything.
I'll definitely keep that in mind.
But in all seriousness, it was great learning from you today. I'm proud that I live in a country in Mexico that has a long and distinguished history of accepting refugees. And at the same time, I've spent probably more than 100 hours in line with refugees trying to get my migration status approved at various points. So I've heard a lot of their stories, and I've also been standing in the freezing cold at 6 in the morning with them, not ethnographically, but substantively, but never with the burden that they carry. Although some of them are carrying Louis Vuitton bags, and some of their burden is well paid for. But I'm referring here to ladies of the manor from Venezuela. So I've learned so much from listening to you today, but I've also learned a great deal from reading your work. And I just hope that the kind of sense and rationality that you help to imbue the debate with about refugee resettlement internationally and nationally will have the sort of effects that it warrants. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was great speaking with you today.